Controversy continues to swirl. Pope Francis makes his first public appearance since a bombshell letter accuses him of a sex abuse cover-up and calls for his resignation. We are at the Vatican. On the money, reaction after a court rules on an atheist group's attempt to take "In God We Trust" off of U.S. currency. Primary results, why all eyes in November will be on the Florida governor's race. And red in the face. For thousands of people in Spain, it's a garden variety food fight. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, August 29th, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. At peace, Archbishop Carlo Vigano breaks his silence today. He insists he wrote the 11-page letter calling for Pope Francis's resignation over his handling of the American sex abuse crisis, not out of revenge or anger, but out of love for the Catholic Church. It comes as Pope Francis addressed the global sex abuse crisis. During his weekly talk in St. Peter's Square, the Holy Father did not mention the turmoil in the American church. Instead, he expressed regret for the way church leaders in Ireland failed to respond.
Ho chiesto perdono al Signore per questi peccati.
The address follows the accusations by Archbishop Carlo Vigano this weekend that the Pope covered up the American cardinal's misdeeds. Pope Francis begged for forgiveness for the abuse pedophile priests perpetrated in Ireland and says he asked the Lord for forgiveness for these sins, for the scandal, and the sense of betrayal it caused. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register, joins us. Ed, the Pope mentioned victims today. Many of them feel they have been forgotten and that church leaders are fighting and pointing fingers. Is there a sense that the Vatican has lost sight of those people who were hurt the most?
Well, there is a concern there, Lauren, in the sense that obviously you've got like two parents quarreling and that the children often get pushed aside. And I think there's a sense that that is happening here. But on the other hand, I think people think, well, if this brings better processes and better ways of dealing with abuse and helping those victims, then maybe in the long run it'll all be for the good. So I think maybe this is just a time that they think they've got to go through in order to get to that point.
So let's talk about where it all began with critics of Archbishop Vigano. And with the letter that he wrote, that's where it began. The critics are the ones calling into questions inconsistencies and gaps in his testimony, calling for Pope Francis's resignation, including something from Minnesota. Tell us about those gaps and what are the criticisms?
Okay, well, there's some gaps in this testimony. I think people criticize it for being perhaps a little too emotional. There isn't a lot of information there backing it up. There's no documentation, at least, put in with the testimony. Although Archbishop Vigano is known to be a man of integrity and is somebody who's very respected, this testimony does have certain weaknesses to it, they say, and that's some of them. But also, I think in terms of Archbishop Vigano's history, this case in Minnesota, he's issued a statement saying that there is no proof that he obstructed an investigation into abuse, that he didn't cover it up. But we haven't actually got on the record statements corroborating that from Minnesota yet.
So there is no clear answer on that. There's also no clear direction coming from the Vatican about how it is going to deal with the crisis. What are you hearing?
Well, that isn't clear either, and it's obviously still early days, and they're still trying to decide what they can do. Although, of course, they've had many years in which to really try to decide how to deal with the crisis. But I think one aspect which I think people are concerned about is on Cardinal McCarrick and how he was allowed, despite sanctions imposed on him by Benedict, to continue to live a public life having been told that he couldn't. And I think questions are going to be asked, well, why did that happen, and why were these sanctions not properly enforced?
Right, that's by both popes. If the restrictions were brought by Benedict XVI, why weren't they enforced by either of those popes? Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Lauren.
As we continue covering this story on EWTN News Nightly, we are hearing from victims of abuse that the church is not addressing their pain. And it's important that we continue to hear their stories. Joining us now is one of the victims. Faith Hexley was sexually assaulted by a priest when she was 15 years old. The priest was sentenced to prison, defrocked, and deported to his native country. Faith, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
As a survivor, what were your first thoughts when you heard the information from the Pennsylvania grand jury report that said more than 300 priests there abused more than 1,000 children over 70 years?
It was like a wound being opened up all over again. And it tells me that not enough has been done. And the USCCB in particular, they have their blinders on, which they clearly need to take off, and they need to do something. We're hearing a lot of words from the Pope and other bishops, some good, some bad, unfortunately. But really, all I'm hearing is words. I want to see some action.
I think you're not alone. You know, we are hearing from some of the bishops demanding investigations. We're hearing from the lay people who say they want to be involved in those investigations. But let's move forward to some solutions. In 2008, you and 4 other survivors met privately with Pope Benedict XVI when he visited the United States. We have a picture of it right here. Tell us about that meeting. Was that one-on-one meeting helpful in comforting you?
It was for me. I can't speak for anyone else in the room, but it's hard to put into words there was something that went on that day in that room that I really can't put into words. I had it planned that I was going to say something really amazing and powerful and show him what a survivor I was. And really the last minute when it was my turn to go up and meet him, I just cried. But I think my tears said everything that I wanted to say. It spoke for not only my pain, but for the pain of my family and for the pain of all the other survivors who maybe have never had a voice.
Well, given your experience, Faith, should Pope Francis meet with all the victims? It might seem like that's impossible, but can the Vatican find a way to invite survivors so that the Pope can address them directly?
It sounds like a wonderful idea. I hadn't really thought about it. However, I'm not sure how open some survivors are going to be to that until we actually see something happening. Again, seeing that action taking place. I would welcome the idea of him visiting maybe all the different countries that have been affected, maybe to a centralized location, for example, some here in the US. For someone like me who can't really travel to Rome because of my family, what I would really love to see is survivors given the opportunity to speak in front of the USCCB at their November conference, because they need to see the faces of the survivors, they need to hear their names, they need to hear their stories and hear and see the impact that their failures have had on the survivors and their families.
You've written that your experience rocked your faith, but it didn't destroy your faith. And you have young children. Are you afraid for them as they grow up in the church?
I'm afraid for them, not just because of not just in the church. My husband and I, we shelter our children. We don't isolate them, but we shelter them no matter where we go. It's not just a church thing because of the abuse. You know, this goes on everywhere. As far as our faith, this crisis has actually encouraged us to want to instill in them even more our Catholic faith, because they are our future. They are our future generation. Our ultimate goal is to get them to heaven, and we want to encourage our children to want the same goals for when they're grown.
Faith, thank you so much for your insight as a survivor of sexual abuse. Faith Hexley, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
A committee created by American bishops, the USCCB, to prevent clergy sexual misconduct is calling for an investigation to be led by lay people, saying the bishops can't be trusted. The National Review Board says the current scandals stem from a loss of moral leadership, and the laity need to assume courageous leadership. The board was formed in 2002 after the clergy sex abuse scandal that started in the Boston Archdiocese. Some pilgrims who come to St. Peter's Square are not focused on what the church can do to ameliorate the tainted crisis and the leaders and the impact it has had on them, but believe that there is one thing that keeps them coming back.
The faith is one thing, and the church is another. So my faith is strong.
Our Rome team says the scandal didn't appear to affect the number of people who packed into the square for the Pope's weekly talk. A United Nations report accuses Nicaragua's government of widespread repression. The UN is calling on President Daniel Ortega to stop persecuting protesters. More than 300 people have died in violence that began in April after the president cut Social Security benefits. Church leaders in that Catholic country have been targeted in the unrest. Russia says hundreds of thousands of troops are getting ready to conduct the country's largest military exercise since the Cold War. A Kremlin spokesperson says Chinese and Mongolian soldiers will also participate in next month's Wargames, and that has U.S. allies worried. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reports from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. The full-scale military maneuvers come amid heightened tensions between Russia on one side and the United States and NATO on the other. Officials with the military alliance say they're seeing a more assertive Russia, which is increasing its military presence. NATO officials say the Russians plan to conduct major military exercises show Moscow is focused on large-scale conflict. The War Games will be the biggest since Soviet drills in 1981. The Russian defense minister saying the 5 days of maneuvers in September will be unprecedented in terms of scope and number of troops. The exercises in central and eastern Russia will involve 300,000 troops, 36,000 vehicles, and more than 1,000 aircraft. In addition, China will send 3,200 troops and roughly 900 pieces of military hardware. The Kremlin spokesperson says Chinese participation demonstrates a growing connection between the two countries. Dmitry Peskov is also defending the use of state funds for the exercise, saying it's justified despite economic problems in Russia. The U.S. and many of its European allies have imposed harsh sanctions on Russia after a nerve agent attack in Britain. The first round of sanctions were implemented after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and backed pro-Russian rebels in eastern Ukraine. Russia's war games are likely to worry Japan, which has already complained about a Russian military buildup. Russia blames Japan for escalating the conflict after the Japanese installed a U.S. missile defense system. The Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is scheduled to attend a forum in Russia the same week as the military exercises, September 11th through the 15th. Russia has invited the head of NATO to come and observe the exercises, but NATO has yet to respond. Lauren?
Wyatt, you were there this afternoon for the State Department's press briefing. What did the spokesperson say about the military drills?
Well, spokesperson Heather Nauert did not specifically address the military drills in particular, but she did condemn Russia's rhetoric on Syria and had a lot to say about that. Both the United States and Russia are concerned about a possible chemical weapons attack in the country again. Now, the United States, Heather Nauert says the United States will not accept any more chemical attacks or the use of chemical weapons by Syrian President Bashar Assad, who's backed by Russia. Russia, on the other hand, says it's the rebels who are the ones who could potentially use chemical weapons, so the two sides seem far from a diplomatic solution. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reporting from the State Department. Thank you, Wyatt. The head of a U.S. delegation touring Syria says American troops will remain in the country.
We will defeat ISIS, and we will work to stabilize this region.
William Roback, who is with the State Department, spoke with tribal leaders in the northeastern part of the country. The Pentagon says around 2,000 American troops are still in Syria. 140 migrants arriving last night in Italy were greeted by protests and cheers. A Catholic center near Rome welcomed them. They spent 10 days on a Coast Guard ship because Italy refused to let them disembark. Catholic bishops in Albania and Ireland agreed to take the refugees. In Spain today, a situation is ripe for a food fight. and a huge mess. Wow. 20,000 people paint the town red by throwing tomatoes at each other. It's the annual Tomatina Festival, inspired by a food fight with local children in 1945. This year, 160 tons of tomatoes were used. Coming up, why Florida governor's race could be a referendum on President Trump. And today in Arizona, the first of 5 days of services honoring the late Senator John McCain. A Jesuit priest honors the late Senator John McCain as his body laid in state at the Arizona Capitol building.
Let these tears bring blooms in the desert he loved, in the country he served, and in all our hearts. Amen.
Father Edward Reese delivered the invocation. He was president of the Jesuit high school from which two of McCain's sons graduated. The family was visibly upset today. The casket was placed above a seal with the state motto, God enriches. Big primary wins set up a fierce battle for the fall election. A liberal Democrat will face off against a conservative Republican in Florida's governor's race. It could be a preview of the next presidential election. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi gives us a roundup. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. Many Americans are watching Florida closely. It's a major swing state. Arizona also held a primary. The president won both states in 2016 and wants to keep them red. Even though his name wasn't on the ballot yesterday, he played a big role.
Congressman Ron DeSantis won the Republican nomination in Florida's race for governor.
100% pro-life, backed by the big man himself.
DeSantis is a strong Trump ally in Congress and frequent guest on News Nightly.
We have Gorsuch on the U.S. Supreme Court, and we're going to add Brett Kavanaugh next.
The Catholic conservative will face off against a liberal Democrat backed by Bernie Sanders.
Are y'all ready to put Florida blue?
Tallahassee Mayor Andrew Gillum would be Florida's first black governor. He's calling for the impeachment of President Trump.
He's already incriminated himself by interfering with the Department of Justice, firing Jim Comey, of whom I'm no fan of, but basically obstructing justice. And ever since that time, he has only driven deeper down a pretty dark hole.
Another closely watched state is Arizona. Fighter pilot turned Republican Congresswoman Martha McSally beat conservative challengers.
I'm working with President Trump to secure our border and keep Arizona families safe.
My friend Martha McSally, she's the real deal. She's tough.
Arizonans can't afford their health care. Some people don't have it. Those who do have it are paying too much.
Kirsten Sinema says end the partisan nonsense and protect Arizona.
We're skeptical.
McSally will run against Democratic Congresswoman Kirsten Sinema for the seat of retiring Republican Jeff Flake.
A big question tonight in Arizona, who will replace the late John McCain? It's up to the state's governor to appoint a replacement. Governor Doug Ducey, a Republican, says he'll make that appointment after McCain's funeral. Lauren?
Martha McSally is getting praise from the president. I met her. Her credentials are impeccable, but he did not endorse her in the primary. Why not?
That's right. He did finally endorse her, though, today. One of his campaign allies, former Sheriff Joe Arpaio, was one of the other candidates running against McSally. And if you remember, Lauren, the president actually pardoned the sheriff.
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. A federal judge decides the motto, "In God We Trust," can stay on U.S. currency and says it is not an establishment of religion. The firm that submitted a brief supporting the motto praises the ruling.
We're not going to have to sandblast the currency. That's good news for the country. You don't need to spend billions of dollars to appease some atheist activists. But it's also really good news because now we're going to have a lot more consistency, a lot more reliability, and a lot more credibility to the way we understand religious freedom in our country.
Daniel Bloomberg notes Raymond Grunder, the judge who wrote the opinion, is on President Trump's shortlist for the Supreme Court and is well respected. Beckett, the law firm, also defends EWTN. White House counsel Don McGahn is leaving his job this fall after the Senate votes on the nomination of Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. McGahn has played a pivotal role in the president's appointment of young conservative judges. He also helped guide his selection of Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch and the president's nomination of Kavanaugh. But McGahn clashed with the president over the Russia investigation. White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders says there are no plans for his replacement. Up next, a prominent Catholic author and professor explains why he fears the church is headed for civil war. A prominent Catholic author and college professor fears the church is on the verge of a civil war. Robert George was referring to allegations by a former Vatican diplomat Pope Francis covered up sex abuse. George says of the internal fighting, we have no idea how long it will last or what its consequences will be. He also calls for an immediate independent investigation into the charges, adding, "Heaven help us." Joining me right now is Robert George, McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University. Robert, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Lauren. Thanks for having me back.
You've said we can't look forward until we look back. There have been great divisions in the church. We can go back as far as the Middle Ages, or just 2 years ago over the apostolic exhortation, the joy of love, and the controversy over possible communion for divorced and civilly remarried Catholics. How far back are you talking?
Well, right now I'm just talking about victims of sexual harassment and abuse at the hands of clergy. And I'm talking about bishops who failed in their obligation to deal with legitimate claims of sexual harassment and abuse, sometimes reassigning priests without informing the parishes to which they were being assigned that these were priests who had records of abuse. So that's how far back I'm looking just at the moment. Of course, if we want to go back in the history of the church, we can find that the church has often experienced corruption. It required a cleansing. It required renewal. It required reform. That's throughout the history of the church. But when I'm saying look back right now, I mean, don't forget the victims. Don't forget the people who need our care and attention, who need to be made whole now, not just financially, although that too, but also emotionally, spiritually.
Let's talk about that. We had a victim on the show earlier, and they do feel left out of this,
Yes.
especially since the finger pointing has happened. What are they to do?
Well, I think that they should continue to advocate for reform of the church. They should continue to demand that their rights be honored, but they shouldn't be alone. The rest of us, those of us who've not ourselves personally been victims, need to be advocates for them as well. Now, that doesn't mean we don't also look forward. When I say look back, I don't mean only look back. I mean don't fail in our obligation to have accountability for past wrongdoing, to attend to the needs of victims. But we need to look forward, too. That means we need to put into place procedures, institutions, practices to ensure that what has gone on in the past does not continue to happen. Now, no system's perfect. We're not going to get a perfect system.
Well, we could get a system that does work.
That's right. We can get a system that works for people, and that's what we need.
The church would argue that that system that did work was the 2002 Dallas Agreement, in which there were rules put in place over sex abuse. And we heard from the review board, the National Review Board at the Bishops' Conference, saying lay people now need to be running the show. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that lay people have to be involved. I mean, one of the lessons that I think we now have to draw is that lay involvement is absolutely essential. There needs to be accountability, including accountability of clergy and the episcopate to the laity. Now that doesn't mean that the laity get to boss the bishops around any more than the bishops should really be bossing the laity around. All of us in the church have our roles. All of us have our vocations. But none of us are merely the instruments of others. All of us have a role to play, exercising a certain kind of authority. And I think lay oversight is going to be essential. That's part of the lesson of the most recent scandal with Archbishop McCarrick.
Here in
We've got
Washington.
to look into those investigations. That's exactly right. We need to look into those. We need to have an investigation into that wrongdoing, into people who abetted McCarrick, people who failed to discipline McCarrick, people who let this go on, people who knew about it, and the inquiry cannot be just done by the bishops.
It has to be the lay people, if that's right. I know we have very little time left. I'm so sorry, I could talk to you forever. I know that people are looking to you and to other prominent Catholics for your opinion, your advice in what to do in what you call this storm where we are all at sea. Robert George McCormick, Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lauren. My pleasure.
For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. If you have stories about the crisis in the church, send them to me at Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter. Good night, and God bless you.